Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Dramatic orchestral music rises as the screen fades in from black. Against a backdrop of aged parchment, war-torn battlefields, and flickering candlelight illuminating quills and ink, the voiceover begins with urgency. He was an orphan, an immigrant, a war hero, and the architect of American capitalism. But how much do you really know about Alexander Hamilton? This bold opening instantly positions Hamilton not just as a founding father, but as a figure of contradiction, complexity, and myth, someone whose life feels as cinematic as it was historically significant. The camera cuts between sweeping shots of the Caribbean, Revolutionary War reenactments, the dueling grounds at Weehawken, and the marble pillars of the U.S. Treasury, subtly suggesting the many worlds Hamilton moved through and shaped. The narration teases the dualities and tensions that define his legacy. Was he a champion of liberty or a man comfortable with elitism? Did he fight for equality, or was he complicit in America's founding inequalities, especially regarding slavery? Did his death in a dramatic duel with Aaron Burr immortalize a patriot or extinguish a dangerous political firebrand? These contrasts build immediate intrigue, inviting the viewer to reconsider what they think they know. The opening then offers a crisp preview of the journey ahead. Hamilton's turbulent upbringing, his meteoric rise through the Revolutionary War, the political clashes that defined a generation, and the truth behind both the financial systems he built and the enemies he made. It sets the tone for an episode that promises not just facts but revelations, an invitation to look past the Broadway spotlight and into the raw, often messy truth of a man who helped build the American experiment. Born in 1755, or possibly 1757, as the exact year remains debated, on the small Caribbean island of Nevis, Alexander Hamilton entered the world under the heavy shadow of social stigma. He was the illegitimate son of a Scottish merchant and a French Huguenot mother who had once been imprisoned for adultery. His early years were marked by loss and hardship. When his father abandoned the family and his mother died of illness, young Hamilton was left orphaned in a world that offered little to children like him. He found work as a clerk in a local trading house on St. Croix, where his sharp intellect and tireless work ethic caught the attention of local elites. A turning point came in 1772, after a hurricane devastated the island. Hamilton's detailed, emotional letter describing the storm was published in a local newspaper, and it so impressed community leaders that they pooled resources to send the teenage prodigy to North America for an education. Arriving in New York, he enrolled at King's College, today's Columbia University, immersing himself in Enlightenment philosophy, revolutionary politics, and a country on the brink of revolt. Hamilton's story is the quintessential rags to political power arc. He came to America with nothing but his ambition and brilliance, and in a land promising liberty and opportunity, he would climb, through words, war, and raw determination, to the very heart of the nation's founding. His early struggles forged a man obsessed with order, stability, and national strength, values that would define both his politics and the institutions he built. As the American colonies inched toward open rebellion, Alexander Hamilton quickly aligned himself with the patriot cause. His eloquence and political writing drew early attention, but it was his military prowess that cemented his rise. He joined a New York militia and soon became captain of an artillery company, where his leadership and discipline stood out. In 1777, his talents caught the eye of General George Washington, who appointed him as aide-de-camp, effectively making Hamilton his chief staff officer. In this role, Hamilton was more than a mere assistant. He drafted correspondence, strategic plans, and reports for Washington, playing a key behind-the-scenes role in shaping revolutionary policy and military decisions. Though often frustrated by his desk-bound duties and yearning for battlefield glory, Hamilton became indispensable, earning Washington's trust and forming a deep, if occasionally strained, mentorship that would define much of his future. Hamilton finally got his wish for combat in 1781 at the decisive Battle of Yorktown. Commanding a battalion in a daring night assault on British Redoubt 10, he led his men to victory with speed and precision. This contribution was critical in breaking British lines and securing the American triumph that ended the war. The American Revolution was not merely a proving ground for Alexander Hamilton's military capabilities, it was the crucible that forged his political identity and gave him a front-row seat to the mechanics of revolutionary power. Entering the war as a young immigrant of modest means, Hamilton quickly rose through the ranks due to his exceptional intellect, discipline, and capacity for leadership. But perhaps more transformative than his battlefield experience was his close proximity to the epicenter of the Revolution's political and strategic decision-making. Serving as an aide-de-camp to General George Washington, Hamilton was not only entrusted with drafting correspondence and organizing intelligence, but also with helping coordinate military and diplomatic strategy. In this role, he gained intimate access to the highest echelons of the revolutionary movement, interacting regularly with men who would become America's most influential founders. This exposure cultivated in him a deep understanding of the fragility of government, the dangers of disunity, and the need for efficient centralized authority. Hamilton's letters and memoranda from the period already showed signs of the Federalist ideology he would later champion, an emphasis on order, fiscal responsibility, and national cohesion. The war also hardened Hamilton's belief that personal valor and public virtue had to be matched by structural strength. He witnessed firsthand the disarray caused by the weak financial systems of the Continental Congress, the lack of coordination among states, and the inefficiencies of decentralized governance. These experiences left a lasting impression on him and fueled his post-war mission to build a federal government with real fiscal and administrative power. When the war ended, Hamilton emerged not just as a war hero, but as a political visionary. He understood that victory over Britain had opened a new, precarious chapter for the United States. Without unity, stability, and economic structure, the dream of independence could quickly collapse. Thus, he set about shaping the future of the Republic, not merely preserving it, but transforming it. His later contributions from the Federalist Papers to the establishment of the National Bank and the Treasury Department all trace back to lessons forged in wartime. That power, while dangerous, was necessary, and that only a well-designed, centralized system could preserve liberty in the long term. Hamilton's rise, therefore, wasn't a fluke of circumstance. The Revolution gave him a platform, but it was his combination of ambition, brilliance, and strategic insight, sharpened through constant exposure to crisis and leadership, that made him one of the architects of modern American governance. His legacy is inseparable from the central lesson he drew from the Revolution, that independence was not enough. Nationhood required structure, strength, and vision. After the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton turned his energies toward constructing a viable government for the fledgling United States. He became a key figure in the movement to replace the weak Articles of Confederation with a new, more effective Constitution. To rally public support, Hamilton joined forces with James Madison and John Jay to write the Federalist Papers, a series of essays that explained and defended the proposed Constitution. Hamilton wrote a staggering 51 of the 85 essays, outlining arguments for a strong central government, checks and balances, and the need for federal authority over states. These writings not only swayed public opinion at the time, but remain foundational texts in American political philosophy. When George Washington became the first president, he appointed Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton immediately began crafting the architecture of the American economy, believing that a strong national financial system was essential to securing the country's independence and future power. He proposed the federal assumption of state debts from the war, a system of tariffs, and the creation of a national bank to stabilize the currency and promote credit. These measures, though controversial, passed with support from key figures like Washington, and were fiercely opposed by rivals like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Hamilton's vision for America was bold and modern. He wanted the United States to become a commercial and industrial power, guided by a strong central government that could wield financial tools to shape national destiny. He introduced the idea of public credit, that the government should borrow responsibly and repay debts, thus gaining the trust of investors at home and abroad. His policies laid the groundwork for American capitalism and positioned the U.S. to grow into a global economic force. Even as his influence stirred deep divisions, Hamilton was undeniably one of the most brilliant architects of the nation. someone who transformed abstract ideals into functioning institutions that still define the American system today. As Hamilton's influence grew, so did his list of powerful enemies. His vision for a strong central government and an industrialized economy clashed directly with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's ideal of a republic rooted in agriculture and states' rights. This ideological divide became one of the first major political feuds in American history, laying the foundation for the nation's first political parties: Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Jefferson viewed Hamilton as dangerously monarchical, fearing that his admiration for British financial models and centralized power threatened the revolutionary ideals they had just fought for. The feud was not only political, but deeply personal, fueled by mutual disdain and conflicting worldviews. But Hamilton's enemies didn't have to look far for ammunition. In 1797, Hamilton became the central figure in America's first political sex scandal, the Reynolds Affair. Years earlier, he had engaged in an extramarital relationship with Maria Reynolds, whose husband, James Reynolds, blackmailed Hamilton in exchange for his silence. When political opponents accused Hamilton of financial corruption, he responded not by denying the affair, but by publishing the Reynolds pamphlet, a 95-page document confessing to the relationship in explicit detail to prove his innocence of economic wrongdoing. Though it cleared him of corruption, the pamphlet destroyed his personal reputation and strained his family life. Hamilton's position on slavery further complicates his legacy. He was outspoken in his opposition to slavery in abstract terms, and was involved with the New York Manumission Society, which advocated for abolition. However, unlike some abolitionists of the time, Hamilton's record is inconsistent. He did not own slaves himself, but he worked closely with wealthy slave owners and did little to challenge the institution in practical ways when shaping the new nation's economic policies. His marriage into the Schuyler family, prominent New York slaveholders, further blurred the line between principle and practice. Moreover, Hamilton's insistence on a strong federal government and his alignment with wealthy elites led critics to label him as aristocratic and out of touch with the common people. His rivals portrayed him as an elitist who favored bankers and industrialists over farmers and laborers. While Hamilton believed that a well-managed elite was necessary to guide the republic's development, many Americans feared his policies would create a ruling class akin to the British aristocracy they had just overthrown. These controversies made Hamilton one of the most polarizing figures of the early republic, hailed as a genius by his supporters and a dangerous schemer by his enemies. By 1804, Alexander Hamilton's long-simmering rivalry with Aaron Burr had reached a breaking point. The two men had clashed for years, politically, ideologically, and personally. Burr, a fellow Revolutionary War veteran and the sitting Vice President of the United States, had once sought Hamilton's endorsement for high office. Instead, Hamilton repeatedly worked behind the scenes to thwart Burr's ambitions, calling him unprincipled and dangerous. When Burr ran for governor of New York and lost, in part due to Hamilton's influence, Burr saw it as the final insult. Their animosity came to a head when a newspaper published a report that Hamilton had insulted Burr at a private dinner, calling him a dangerous man who ought not be trusted with power. Burr demanded an apology. Hamilton, known for his pride and unwillingness to back down, refused. That led to the infamous challenge, a duel at dawn on July 11, 1804, on the bluffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, the same spot where Hamilton's own son Philip had died in a duel just 3 years earlier. The exact details of what happened that morning remain murky. What we do know is this: both men took their positions and 2 shots rang out. Hamilton, according to some witnesses, may have fired into the air, possibly intending to throw away his shot. Burr, however, struck Hamilton in the lower abdomen. The wound was devastating, passing through vital organs and lodging in his spine. Hamilton was taken across the river to Manhattan, where he died the next day in agonizing pain, surrounded by friends and family. The death of Alexander Hamilton in 1804 reverberated deeply through the fledgling United States, a tragic end to a life that had shaped the nation in ways both profound and controversial. Hamilton's fatal duel with Aaron Burr not only marked the violent end of a brilliant career, but also crystallized the personal and political rift that had existed between the two men, and more broadly, underscored the bitter factionalism that had emerged in post-revolutionary America. Hamilton had already cemented his place in history as one of the most important and visionary figures of the early republic. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he had laid the financial foundations of the United States, establishing a strong national economy, creating the first central bank, and advocating for the federal assumption of state debts, all of which were pivotal in stabilizing the young nation. His intellectual legacy, particularly through the Federalist Papers, helped define the framework of American government and ensured the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. He had a grand vision for America as a powerful, centralized nation-state, but his beliefs often placed him at odds with key figures like Thomas Jefferson and, in this case, Aaron Burr. Burr, who had served as vice president under Thomas Jefferson, was a man of ambition, but his political career was marred by controversy, especially in his final years. His duel with Hamilton stemmed from a culmination of personal animosities and political disagreements. Hamilton, a fierce opponent of Burr, had criticized him in public and worked against his political aspirations, most notably during the 1800 election when Hamilton's efforts were instrumental in preventing Burr from becoming president after a tie in the electoral vote. This created a deep animosity between the two men, culminating in the infamous challenge to a duel. The duel itself, fought in Weehawken, New Jersey on July 11, 1804, was a tragic spectacle that not only ended Hamilton's life but also sealed Burr's political fate. While Hamilton's death was mourned by many, his loss seen as a national tragedy, it was Burr's political career that crumbled in its wake. Burr was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though the I-1's charges were later dropped due to legal technicalities. His reputation, however, was irreparably tarnished. The public perceived him as a murderer, and his hopes of securing political power were shattered. Burr's ambitions never recovered, and he spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Hamilton's death, while personally devastating, also marked the tragic end of a visionary who had dedicated his life to shaping the American system of government. His ideals of a strong federal government, a robust economy, and a powerful national identity had often placed him at odds with the anti-federalists and states' rights advocates, including Jefferson and Madison. In the end, Hamilton's political ideas would survive, influencing the nation's development, but his personal sacrifice was profound. His vision, however, was costly, not just in terms of his life, but in the relentless political battles he fought, the enemies he made, and the personal toll it took on his well-being. Hamilton's death also left the country at a crossroads. Without his guiding hand, the political struggles that had characterized the nation's early years would continue to intensify. While Hamilton's vision of a strong, centralized nation would ultimately win out in the long term, the bitterness between the Federalists and the Republicans, as well as the emergence of personal rivalries, marked the complex and often fractious nature of early American politics. His life and death remind us of the fragile balance between ambition, vision, and the personal costs of public service in a young, divided nation. For nearly 2 centuries after his death, Alexander Hamilton's legacy was largely relegated to the margins of American history. While he played a pivotal role in shaping the nation's financial system and political infrastructure, his life was overshadowed by his controversial death in a duel and the rise of other founding fathers, most notably Thomas Jefferson. The memory of Hamilton was further obscured by political battles over his vision of a strong central government versus Jefferson's ideal of agrarian democracy, with Hamilton's ideas frequently dismissed by political rivals. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Hamilton began to experience a revival, largely due to historian Ron Chernow's 2004 biography, Alexander Hamilton. Chernow's work painted Hamilton as a visionary who laid the foundation for America's financial and political institutions, capturing the complexity of his character and ideas. This biography played a critical role in reintroducing Hamilton to the modern public, especially as it delved into his ambition, struggles, and enduring influence on American society. Despite his rising fame in recent years, many myths still surround Alexander Hamilton, some flattering, others oversimplified. One of the most common beliefs is that Hamilton was a staunch abolitionist who opposed slavery from the outset. While he did express anti-slavery sentiments and was involved with the New York Manumission Society, the reality is far more nuanced. Hamilton never owned slaves himself, but he worked closely with slave owners, including his father-in-law, and didn't prioritize abolition in his political agenda. His stance on slavery, like much of his political career, was shaped more by pragmatism and alliances than by pure ideology, revealing a man often caught between moral convictions and political necessity. Another myth is that Hamilton died a universally beloved national hero. In truth, his death in the infamous 1804 duel with Aaron Burr was seen by many as the dramatic end to a divisive figure. At the time, Hamilton was entangled in political feuds, viewed by many as elitist, and blamed for overstepping democratic bounds. His Federalist Party was in decline, and his opposition to both Burr and Jefferson had left him politically isolated. While some mourned his loss, others saw his death as the close of a contentious chapter in early American politics. So how should we remember Hamilton? Was he a genius architect of American institutions, or a dangerous elitist who distrusted the masses? The truth lies somewhere in between. Hamilton's story is one of ambition, innovation, and enduring impact, but also of contradiction, conflict, and complexity. He helped build the foundations of modern finance, governance, and diplomacy, yet his vision of a centralized, powerful government sparked fierce resistance and debate that still echoes in American politics today. Ultimately, Hamilton's legacy invites us to grapple with the nature of leadership, ambition, and democracy itself. He was brilliant, flawed, and ahead of his time, perhaps even ahead of ours. So what do you think Hamilton's story tells us about America today? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more untold stories of history's most fascinating figures, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for what's next. Thanks for diving deep into the real story of Alexander Hamilton with us. Now, we want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about Hamilton's real-life journey? Was it his complex stance on slavery, his dramatic political downfall, or how different he was from the Broadway version? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe so you never miss a moment of untold history. And don't go far. Coming up next, we uncover the forgotten founding father who might have saved the Constitution. You won't want to miss it.